Hi everyone, and welcome to the Real Food Campaign UK. We are here tonight with Dr. Lucy Williamson, and she is going to share her bread evening with us. I had the pleasure of joining Lucy's bread evening last year, and I am still full of the information that I learned from it. So when she said that she would join us today and share it with us all, we jumped at the chance, and we're very, very excited. Lucy is she is a nutritionist, and she has a rather interesting journey to nutrition. She actually began her career as a vet, so she is uniquely placed to really understand healthy farming systems and nature-friendly farming. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Lucy, and yeah, we look forward to learning about bread, all things bread.
Excellent, Emma. Thank you very much. So hopefully you can all hear me fine, and just pop anything in the chat if anything goes wrong with my sound or you can't quite see what I think you can see. I'm going to do a shortish little deck of slides for you in a minute, just to take you through the wonderful things I want to share with you about bread. But thank you. It's just so lovely to get a chance to share this information. The thing I love about being a nutritionist is just like Emma and Georgie actually, is just really trying to give clarity, trying to share really helpful information that we don't always have at our fingertips. So it's really great to have a chance to do that tonight. And a lot of the work I do is certainly all focused around how our food is produced, and sort of climate friendly food, food that's farmed with nature, and how that really impacts our health as well as our planet. And of course, having had my vet background, as Emma said, I'm always very much connected with the land and even animal welfare with all my nutrition work. So I am going to share my screen, and right, so just bear with me just one quick minute while I just get this set up as seamlessly as I can. Okay, 2 seconds. Okay, right. The gallery, always ends up in the wrong place on your screen, doesn't it? So it's tricky to see everything, but here we go. Okay. So I'm hoping you can all now see that first picture. Do pipe up if not. So Emma and Georgie, just any problems, just shout at me. So can I just, because I can't see you, it's always a bit disarming when we do this, because all of a sudden I can't see anybody. So Georgie or Emma, everything is fine? Brilliant.
Absolutely fine. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So I also run the Gut Project, which is all about how we need to really look after what's going in our gut, what's going on in our gut, to look after our overall health. And that involves how our food is produced and the types of food we need to be eating. And basically we're talking about real food, the type of food the Real Food Campaign are really trying to promote as well. Foods that are minimally processed, still retain much of the goodness that they had when they were growing. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But basically what I'm trying to do, and this bread evening is all part of this initiative, if you like, is to just reconnect our health back to real food and how it's farmed. So I think that the lovely thing about bread is that it is a fantastic way to talk about connecting our health back to nature, because we're going to think right back to the grains and how they're grown and how they've been processed over the years in order to make bread as we now know it, which unfortunately isn't as nutritious as it should be. So the purpose of tonight is really just to help you to be able to simplify this sort of aura around bread that we all worry that maybe it's a bit loaded with carb, or it's a bit leaves us feeling a bit bloated, and maybe it's not great if we're trying to lose a bit of weight, and all these issues. And actually, I'm just going to enjoy sharing with you the next half an hour all that's really good about our bread. The fact that it's meant to be a very nutritious food, so it nourishes us rather than just feeding us. And I think a lot of that has been forgotten in bread. So at the end, hopefully tomorrow, in your email inbox, we'll follow some notes from tonight, so you can just sit back and listen. And also, I've been brave and shared a recipe for sourdough with you, and that will come to you tomorrow as well. And I want to say right from the beginning that I am going to talk a reasonable amount about sourdough tonight, but sourdough is a real art, and there are some amazing artisan bakers who have that art and that skill, and they've been doing it for years and years and years and produce the most amazing sourdough loaves. I have been doing it maybe for about 5 years, and I'm very much a beginner, but I just sort of want to try and normalize it and share with you a simple recipe if you want to try and get started at home, and some of the sort of really important things to know. So as I say, I've packaged that recipe up, and it'll be with you tomorrow. So just a quick little sort of introduction about gut health, because actually nutritious, traditional, wholesome breads can really feed our gut health. So what do we mean by gut health? Well, I know many of you will probably know this, but just so we're all starting at the same level. So inside our colon, our large intestine, we all have billions of microbes, little microorganisms, many types of bacteria and yeasts and some fungi, commonly known as microbes, and they are unique to us. It's like a fingerprint. Each of us have a very different one. And what we want to do through life is nurture those microbes with the right kind of food, and lifestyle comes into it as well. But tonight we're talking all about food. And the best kind of food for our microbes is fiber, which is in plants, so fruit and vegetable, grains, nuts and seeds, pulses, beans, legumes, any type of plants that's your best source of fiber. And the bigger variety of fiber that you can eat, the better for nurturing those microbes. Why do we want to nurture them? Because we know now from amazing science that they are connected to just about every single health condition, and they really protect our health as we go through life. And that really makes sense, because microbes have been on this planet for billions, about 10 billion years, whereas we human beings have been on our planet for about 10 million years. So we've evolved with our microbes, and we really need them. We need each other. They're really part of our survival. And the reason that we can link our health and the importance of how our food is farmed back to the soil is because those same microbes are also essential for healthy soil. They help the crops to absorb nutrients. They unlock the nutrients in the soil for plants to grow and be dense with nutrients. And that's exactly what they do for us as well. They sort of do the things in our gut that we can't do ourselves, and they unlock nutrients as well as many other functions. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. I'm going to kind of weave it in as we go, but I just wanted to kind of set the scene as far as gut health goes. So let's just get started on bread. So compagnon, I think, is just a lovely French word, and basically means somebody that we share bread with. So seems like a really good way to start this evening. And really, this is all about bringing back the value of just sharing good food together. You know, what better food than bread to just sit around the table with friends and family and savor food that is very, very nutritious, but really simple as well. So I think we've lost, probably not those of you that are here tonight because you're obviously so interested in food, but the value has gone. We don't value our food as we should do. And so another reason for understanding tonight as we go on the real value in bread. So it is, and it has been for as long as man has existed, almost, an absolutely essential food. Armies have marched on it. Egyptians have built the pyramids on it. It is an essential food for our health. It should be a very nutritious food, or as is the case now, really a lot of the bread that we see has become a bit of an industrialized health disaster, leaving us feeling uncomfortable, feeling that we just have to avoid bread altogether. And the problem there is that we are limiting then the nutrients that we should be able to enjoy from bread. So what I want to do is to kind of think about it as how it used to be our complete staple food, and literally used to be in life. You know, people were paid in loaves of bread, and so it's just what I want to do is just take a couple of minutes just to kind of think back about the sort of history of bread, if you like, and what's gone wrong to take us to where we are now. So if we just think about the story of wheat, I just love this story that early man was nomadic, and that was basically because they went where the food was. So the wheat would grow and the grain would be scattered in the wind, and the wheat would grow next in a new place, and man would follow where the wheat grew. And so it went on. And then all of a sudden there was actually a mutation in the wheat, and the stems became very weak. So the grain actually fell where the wheat grew. And what that meant was that man could gather the grain and actually plant it where he wanted to plant it. And that was one of the ways that early farming began. And so, you know, up until that point, we were, well, I was, let me just get my words right here. So that was almost the first example of man becoming a little bit more stationary, if you want to think about it like that. But if we just hop forward then to the 20th century, then what we found was that most people were connected to bread in one way or another, either through farming, maybe through harvesting, maybe through milling, maybe through threshing, maybe it was the baker, but generally everybody was connected to bread in some way. So people were connected back to the land and how their food was made, where it came from. But in a very, very short space of time, in the last 100 years, there's been a huge industrialization of our bread making. And what that's resulted in is a 70% loss in the types of grain that we now still have in the UK, because the grain has been bred to make it easier to bake, to produce a lighter loaf. And there are many great people now trying to establish these ancient grains again. But I always think it's really great to remember that for almost 400 BC, Plato was saying people would eat rough country breads from wholesome wheat and barley, and with such a diet be expected to live in peace and health to a good age. And of course, now we look upon that kind of bread as very as artisan bread. It's not the norm. It's expensive, and yet it used to be the kind of bread I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is very unprocessed and especially sourdough, extremely natural, is the kind of bread that peasants would live off, and the rich people would have the purest white form of bread and pay a lot for that. So we need to listen to Plato, certainly, because he really realized the healthfulness of it. So if we come to the present day, what happens now is we walk down the bread aisle in a supermarket, and here's the extreme. We've got plastic wrapped sliced loaves, but here's the difficult thing. These are brown loaves, they're wholemeal loaves. So what I don't want to do tonight is come over as being really idealistic and to expect everybody to suddenly go out and start making their own homemade bread. So I'm a busy mum, and I certainly will pull one of these loaves off the shelf every now and then, because I just don't have time to make my own at home. But what I'm going to describe to you is even what we think is a healthy, wholesome brown loaf on a supermarket shelf is actually a far cry from what our body really needs when it comes to nourishment. So where did it all go wrong? So I guess sort of late 1800s, traditional milling really came to an end. So whereas all flour used to be milled between two stones, hence the term stone ground flour, technical advances, particularly in America in the late 1800s, all of a sudden meant that we were really able to mass produce flour. So we went from stone grinding flour to huge industrial steel rollers. And what happened was that flour was so uniform and so easy to repeat that the bakers loved it, because it meant they could produce a very regular loaf. They could produce the same quality of loaf time after time. And of course, it sold really well. It was cheaper to produce because you could get the flour in such huge quantity. And so there we have that whole industrialization. But the problem was, because then we started taking all the goodness out of the flour, the bran layer and the germ, because the germ contains oils which can go rancid, taking all these things out of the grain to make white flour, you're left with a flour that has a very low shelf life, and you need to add additives back in to preserve it. And obviously we've taken a lot of nutrients out by removing the bran layer and other parts that I'm going to show you in a minute. So we have to start fortifying the flour again. So you end up with a fairly unnatural product, and I'm going to show you a typical label later on, where you can see the enormous number of ingredients there are in a supermarket loaf, which in fact we shouldn't need at all. We should just be able to make bread with flour, water, and a little bit of salt. So the interesting thing is just to note that about the same time that we had this huge industrialization of bread, and you know, I think it's fair to say that was when we first saw the beginning of chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, vitamin deficiencies, diseases of the West, or diseases of affluence, if you like. And, you know, I think you'll understand as we go on that this is why getting back to wholesome food is just so important. So if we can just understand what's in a grain a little bit more, then it'll be a bit clearer. So the grain on the left is the whole grain. So you've got the bran layer on the outside, and that layer in fact contains lots of lovely natural yeasts, B vitamins, which help us to extract the energy from our food, minerals like calcium and iron. It also contains antioxidants, which repair everyday cell damage in our bodies, really important sort of anti-aging function, and also an anti-inflammatory function in our bodies. And then in the middle, you've got this germ, which is just packed full of unsaturated oils like omega-3, vitamin E, which is a lovely fat soluble vitamin, which again has a sort of antioxidant function. These are really vital nutrients in our health. And in the middle then you've got this endosperm, which is the starchy carbohydrate layer. So that's fantastic immediate energy. It's a larder of energy, if you like. But what happens when we refine the grain is that that's all we're left with. We're just left with this bit of energy without any of the other nutrients to go with it. And so when we're eating a loaf, a white loaf, we're just eating starch. We're not giving our bodies any of those other lovely natural nutrients at all. And the other thing about the germ, so the germ is where these really healthful oils are, but they can go rancid quite quickly. So again, removing the germ improves the shelf life of the flour. So, you know, you can understand why man has interfered and done all these things, but it's just we lose the nutrient value of the bread. So bearing all that in mind, it's like this bran layer here that is so important for our gut health, because that's where the fiber is, and it's the fiber that feeds our microbes, because we can't digest that fiber, but our microbes digest it for us, and they actually ferment the fiber. And that process, just like a slowly fermenting loaf of sourdough, the fermentation of fiber that we eat in our diet by our gut bacteria releases all sorts of thousands actually of chemicals that we now know are really crucial in our health. So this is just a little quick picture to again bring in gut health into this chat tonight, in that we eat fiber rich food, nutrient dense as well, because our gut microbes really thrive on not only fiber but nutrient dense food, minimal additives, minimal preservatives. In fact, there was some research recently that even something like an emulsifier that's in a lot of different foods that has a sort of gelatinous function of holding food together and improving the texture and the taste of food. Well, not so much the taste, but the palatability and the texture. That causes havoc with our gut microbes, because it then produces that same environment in our gut, which our microbes don't like at all. So we're all the while thinking about real wholesome food, and we call that prebiotic food, in that it feeds our biome, our bacteria. And then our bacteria in our gut, they ferment it to produce all these postbiotics, these chemicals that protect our health. And they, you know, I mentioned a few things earlier, but they're hugely important in our immune system, hugely important in preventing allergy, asthma, certainly can even help with weight control, protecting from inflammatory conditions. And inflammation is at the root of so much chronic disease that we have now: rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel problems, even some types of cancer, particularly bowel cancer. But we know all these things we can be given protection from these diseases by looking after our gut microbes. So that lovely fiber in a whole grain is very important, as well as all the other fibers in other food. So yeah, what I want to go on and do now is just take a little break from that and go through different kinds of flours, because that is another thing that can get so confusing. So interestingly, whole grain, whole wheat and wholemeal, they're all exactly the same. So it's just how a manufacturer chooses to describe their flour. Technically, those should be flours that have had nothing taken out of them, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Often what happens is a company that produces flour will grind the flour through that industrial process that I was talking about to make the white flour. And presumably because white flour is the flour that is most in demand, and then to create the whole grain and the whole wheat or wholemeal or whatever what you want to call it, the fractions that had been taken out to make the white flour are added back in again. So it may be a much more processed flour than you think. So it's worth looking at where you buy your flour from. I know Emma might have some comments on this later. I really enjoy buying my flour from a company called Hodmedod's. George, you might want to share the website for them on the chat. They're based in Essex, and they support farmers who are farming with no agrochemicals at all, and trying to reintroduce a lot of ancient grains, but certainly milling those flours very naturally, as minimally processed as it can be. And I've got some right beside me that I'm going to show you later, but I buy it by the sackful, literally, online. It's very easy, very quick, very cheap. And that's where I source my flour from, but we can talk about that a bit more afterwards. Stone ground is the real thing. Stone ground flour is literally, it has been ground between those two stones that I mentioned in the traditional way. Rye flour is fabulous. It is particularly brilliant for making sourdough, for at least making your starter with, which I'll talk a bit more when I do a little demonstration at the end, because rye has a very high content of natural yeasts. So it's really good for getting fermentation going. And when we make bread in the traditional way, like sourdough, we're relying purely on the natural yeasts that are present in the flour. Spelt are much more ancient grain, and interestingly, although it has gluten in it, a lot of people find spelt much easier to digest. I'm pretty sure from memory, Emma might help me out here, that the gluten in spelt is a slightly smaller particle, but certainly people do find spelt is easier to digest. And then if you ever see YQ on flour, what that stands for is yield and quantity. And quite interesting that farmers, of course, since the Second World War have been encouraged to farm for yield, which is why we have this huge influx of fertilizers and chemicals that have really ruined our soil, and which is why we're now trying to turn that around and improve our soil once more. But Y stands for yield, and the problem is that we have produced enormous quantities of food to feed us all, but without the quality. And the Q then stands for quality. So some flours have the YQ symbol on them, on the packet, which means that they have been farmed and produced according to very traditional methods, so it's still maintaining a lot of the nutrient value of the original grain. So Hodmedod's, the company I mentioned, they're all YQ flour, and you know that you're getting the most nutritious flour that you can. So I said I would come back to looking at the label, and this is kind of the problem that I want to try and help. Well, I guess I think this slide maybe helps to demonstrate, in that I've got a picture there of, you would grab a Hovis high in fibre wholemeal loaf and think that this is going to be pretty healthy. And it is, in that it's brown and there are definitely good fibre in there, and it's far better, of course, than a white loaf. But even on that loaf, which is marketed for being incredibly healthy, everything that you see listed on here is everything that loaf contains. So that is what's on its label. And sometimes to decode labels and to help people understand what should I be looking for on a label, I try and simplify it by saying, well, just have a look and see how many of the ingredients on a label would you have in your own kitchen cupboard. And if a lot of them you wouldn't, or you don't know what they are, then do you really want to eat them? And of course, they've all been passed. They've all been, the Food Safety Authority has passed them as healthy and fine. But those regulatory methods are slightly questionable, and I think generally it's much better to try and stick to natural foods as much as possible. So it's just interesting to see that, okay, so compared to a loaf of sourdough, which is literally flour, water and salt, we've got all these, and I'm not going to go through them all, but it's just interesting to note that even in this brown loaf, it has added calcium and iron and B vitamins, which shows that it probably was the flour used to make this loaf probably was milled to become white flour and has then had everything added back in again. I don't want to get too complicated, but I'm just trying to help you understand that it's not always what we think it is that we're buying. So lots of other things in here. I mean, oats and wheat flakes and spelt flakes, that's all very nice. Wheat protein always makes me laugh a bit, because actually that is gluten, but of course describing it as wheat protein is more consumer friendly. This is the one I just want to hover on a minute, is yeast. So the key issue that we have now with industrialized bread is that it is made with very fast action, what we call monoculture, so one type of industrialized yeast. So this culture of Saccharomyces yeast is produced in vast quantities, and it is the only yeast that is used in making these industrial loaves. And actually what our body needs is the natural yeast in flour, in that bran layer that I talked about. And when you use the natural yeasts that are present in the grain to make the loaf, we get a nice variety of yeasts. It's what our biology is used to, rather than coping with a large amount of one type of yeast. And actually what we now know is that yeast, when you eat a slice of bread, this kind of bread, the yeast actually goes on fermenting inside us. And so that where we might think we have a bit of a gluten insensitivity because we're left feeling quite bloated after eating processed bread, it may well be that it's just a problem with that one type of yeast that is going on fermenting and causing those discomforts. And so in some ways that's good news, because I think a lot of us feel that perhaps we may have a bit of an intolerance to gluten when actually it's more likely to be the yeast that's the problem. Lots of other things on this label, but E numbers, emulsifiers play havoc, as I said, with our gut health. So that's something to always look out for. And then, under fat, it's still got palm oil in it. Rapeseed oil is a fantastically healthy oil if it's cold pressed, but a lot of our rapeseed oil in this country is still heavily processed. So and may have traces of agrochemicals in it. So again, I try and steer clear of that in the foods that I buy. But as I say, I am a practical mum, and obviously we can't always live as perfectly as we want to. And then we've added in here a preservative, ascorbic acid, which is actually just a type of vitamin C. But again, with a loaf like sourdough, which I'll talk you through in just a minute, we don't need to worry about adding preservatives because it has natural preservatives in it. So basically what I've tried to do there is to kind of take you through the whole story of what's gone wrong with our bread. And the good news is that with a little bit of thought and time, sourdough is the most fabulous answer. It's very cheap to make. It's actually not at all time consuming, and I'm going to try and demonstrate that to you tonight. That's because we are relying on the natural yeasts in the whole wheats to do a lot of the fermenting for us. So rather than all the kneading that you have to do if you're trying to make homemade bread the other way, that's not sourdough, because we have this part of the whole thing of making sourdough is that it's a lovely slow fermentation. It does a lot of the work itself, and while we're sleeping, in fact, which is great. So just flour, water and salt. And I have to say my loaves don't turn out looking as nice as that, but they always taste brilliant. And I think that's the most important thing. I'm a realist, and I've got my loaf here that I'm going to show you later. This is one that I made this morning, and I actually like to still make mine in a tin, but they smell lovely, they taste fabulous, and I'm working on the shape. So so great thing about sourdough, it is a traditional way to preserve bread, and that is because the particular type of bacteria, the lactobacillus, that is involved in the fermentation process, as it ferments the carbohydrate in the dough, it produces those chemicals that I was saying happen within our own gut by our own gut bacteria, and they are actually natural preservatives. That acidic flavor that you get from sourdough is a natural preservative. So so that's great news, and of course all the goodness is kept in. So LAB stands for lactic acid bacteria, and that's what I was talking about there. The acidity is a natural preservative. The other brilliant thing about the slow fermentation that we get with sourdough, and I'm talking sort of 24 hours, it is a long time, is that actually releases and unlocks a lot of the natural nutrients in the grain. So just quite an interesting fact, iron, I mentioned, is in the bran layer, and unfortunately iron can be quite hard to absorb from grain, and some other nutrients as well, like calcium and zinc. These are all really important for our health, because grains have a substance called phytates in them, which actually bizarrely lock those nutrients into the grain so that we can't absorb them. But that slow fermentation breaks down the phytates, and it makes those nutrients really absorbable. And of course, what we don't know in shop bought processed bread, even though those nutrients are added back in, so by law we have to fortify white flour with calcium and iron, we don't really know how well we can absorb it because it's not in its natural form. So slow fermentation makes the nutrients more available to us. The gluten in sourdough, because it's fermented for so long, is largely, if not completely sometimes, broken down into much smaller proteins. So you know, I do hesitate when I say this, but there are many people who have a diagnosed gluten intolerance who can tolerate sourdough because the gluten's been broken down. I would really warn against it if you're diagnosed with celiac, because that's obviously far more serious, although I know that in some cases with celiac disease, people can tolerate it too. So that's good news about gluten, good news about all the other nutrients, good news about the natural preservatives. And the other thing is, once we've baked it, of course, all those natural bacteria and yeasts are killed off in the baking process by the heat. But the chemicals that they have released into the loaf that are good for our health are still in that loaf when we eat it. So that lovely sour flavor that we get contains some of those chemicals that are really, really good for our health. So yeah, so I've sort of covered then that, you know, that it may not be gluten intolerance, it may be industrial yeast that's the problem, and that sourdough is not entirely gluten-free, but certainly can be tolerated in small amounts if you do have a gluten problem, and has this really high digestibility, which is just absolutely great news, fantastic. And just a word about weight control. There are lots of great things about sourdough. So if I have one slice of sourdough for lunch, it's so filling, really, really filling. And that's partly because it's got a lot of fiber in it, and fiber really helps us to feel full. But it's also because those bacteria, some of those chemicals that they produce actually work on our appetite control centers and help us to feel full. So, you know, that and it genuinely does that. It sounds too good to be true, but it does. The other thing is that those same chemicals actually reduce our ability to absorb the starch from bread. So so therefore we're not just getting this rush of energy, because when it's not quite as easy to absorb the starch. But talking about starch, one thing that I think is really interesting, that actually Vanessa Kimball, who has the sourdough school, was talking about recently, was to remember that you know, if we eat high sugar foods like a piece of cake, it's a very processed form of starch. There's all the whole grains taken out, there's no fiber in there at all. And that sort of white flour of a cake and maybe some nice sugary icing is extremely easy for our body to absorb, because it's carbohydrate in its most digestible form. So carbohydrates are chains of sugars, and the more we process a carbohydrate, the shorter the chain becomes until you're left with just a simple sugar, so white table sugar. So we can absorb that instantly, and of course we get quite a sugar high, and our body insulin acts to take that sugar down in our bloodstream, and that and absorb it into our system. And it's the process of that blood sugar coming down that stimulates our appetite. So if we're eating, the converse of that is if we're eating carbohydrates that's still in its very natural form, that has a lot of fiber in it, they're really, really long chains of carbohydrates, and they take a long time for our body to digest them and break them down. So we get this lovely slow release of energy. So our blood sugar isn't going up and down. Therefore, our appetite isn't going up or down. So high fiber foods really help us to feel full for longer. And you may have heard of the GI effect or the glycemic index, but basically what's that saying? If it's got a high GI, actually it's probably if it's got a low GI, sorry, getting into too much detail here, it means it's high fiber, which really helps to control our satiety, to control our appetite. So lots of ways that sourdough can also help with weight control. So there's probably all sorts of things that I've forgotten to say, but I'll maybe talk about it a bit more as I'm taking you through sourdough. What I think, so just before I get going on a bit of a demonstration, and we might just sort of break for a few questions, I'll stop sharing my screen in a minute. It's just to sort of let you see the simplicity of sourdough. It is just 3 simple steps. So first of all, you have a starter. Second, you make what's called your production dough. And third, you make your loaf. Takes from normally about 24 hours, I find, to do it. Very simple. And the symbol that I've got in the bottom of the screen there, which says real bread, is just to remind me to tell you that if you see that stamp on a loaf of sourdough or displayed in a baker's, you know that it's the genuine thing. But again, unfortunately, it's not policed very well. So when you buy a loaf of sourdough in the supermarket, it may not be, the chances are it actually isn't really proper sourdough unless it's got that stamp on it. Often it's just bread that's made in the shape of a lovely artisan loaf, and then they add a little bit of sourdough starter to improve the taste, but it hasn't been made in that way to totally use the natural yeast. So look out for that symbol. That's the kind of best advice I can give you if you're really trying to find the real McCoy. So just very quickly, I was just going to let you know, I told you about my gut project right at the beginning. So this workshop that I'm doing tonight is purely on bread, and we've mentioned a little bit on gut health. Georgie and I do a course on gut health, which is a 6-session course, talking about all the different types of foods and all the important things we can do to really look after our gut health. It's loads of fun. We have lots of food producers coming on. We have podcasts. We have a guy who's an expert breathing coach. There's yoga sessions. We bring in a whole load of lifestyle aspects to the course. And if you're interested in finding out any more about that, please do email me. And just to quickly show you that these are some of the great people that I work with. So our chef Katie is a chef at our local farm and farm shop, Peterlee Manor Farm in Buckinghamshire, and our yoga teacher, and David here, our breathing coach, and a lovely cheese lady who talks all about the wonders of milk and cheese being preserved milk. And of course we bring in the importance of our grazing animals on the course as well, and how they're needed to restore our soils, all part of one system to create healthy soils and healthy food. And then some of you may know Dr. Sally Bell, who's certainly is involved with the Real Food campaign. She helps us out on the course as well. So I just wanted to mention that. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to just set up my 10-minute sourdough demonstration. So if you want to chat while I'm doing that, and Emma, just let me know if it would be fine just to take some questions now, or whatever you'd like to do.
Well, does anybody have any questions? Firstly, thank you, Lucy. That was really, really great.
Good. I'm still here.
Does anyone have any questions for Lucy? You can unmute yourself, or you can write it in the chat box.
Oh yes, okay. Yeah, I have a question, although I'm aware it's probably a very difficult question to answer. I'm interested in this session tonight because although I have a gluten-free diet, my husband is quite a keen lover of bread, and I want him to have the healthiest bread possible. I follow a gluten-free diet because I have an autoimmune disease. I don't have a gluten intolerance as far as I'm aware, because I did have a blood test and it didn't show anything up. But because I've looked at health generally for my condition, which is Hashimoto, so low thyroid or thyroid disease. So my question, I suppose, is I have obviously heard from Lucy that you say that the molecules in the flour for the sourdough is smaller molecules, less of a problem for things like bloating, but presumably I would still not be able to have it if I'm trying to follow my gluten-free diet so that I'm not consuming any gluten molecules at all, because my condition basically, from my research, tells me that the molecule in gluten is very similar to thyroid cells, in which case my condition attacks my thyroid. So if I had gluten, then it would make that condition worse. That's why I'm doing it, if that makes sense. I've not explained it very well.
Yeah, you have. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. So
I mean, it's fine if there isn't an answer, and I think possibly there isn't an answer, and I'm sure you'd like to move on to, to something else. I think maybe I need to stick with my gluten-free, and maybe not indulge in the sourdough, but I can certainly let my husband have that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Emma might have something to add. This is where we do have to be careful, and certainly I mentioned celiac, probably, that's, so you're kind of coming from that same place. Yeah. And I mean, the theory is that, as I say, because of the slow fermentation, the gluten is largely broken down, and often you can find that you can tolerate it, and it's just such a shame to have to miss out. But try with gluten-free flour. I mean, this is one of the things Emma and I actually talked about before this evening, was if we could have for you a recipe using gluten-free flour. And I haven't managed to do that yet, but it is something we want to do. So I would, this is the great thing about sourdough, is it's like gardening. You try it, if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. It'll still probably taste good. So I would try using gluten-free flour, or, just try the smallest amount and see what effect it has on you. I mean, I understand you don't want to trigger anything. But you may be surprised. You may be pleasantly surprised.
Okay, would buckwheat flour be an option for sourdough?
So I've actually done I make a fermented buckwheat bread, and it follows pretty much the same process that Lucy's going to take us through. I don't think it's technically a sourdough because you don't really use a starter. The whole thing is kind of fermented. So it's like a shorter fermentation process in terms of getting the yeast, activating the yeasts. But it does come up really, really nice. And as Lucia said, you do have to try it a couple of times. It definitely is an art, even though it's very simple: soaking, blending, waiting, baking. it's still, you know, sometimes it's does something wacky and you're not quite sure why. I think, are you working with somebody for your Hashimoto's?
Well, not anymore. I did see a nutritionist when I first got diagnosed, but I've sort of followed a gluten-free diet. I try to eat healthily with the things that I should eat and take my medication to keep my thyroid working.
Well, I think Lucy, Georgie and I, this is the work that we do as well. So if you do have any follow-up questions, then please do get in touch. But as Lucy says, she's I mean, I have personally tried it with a gluten-free flour to get the starter, and it did work. I've done it with a buckwheat flour and it worked as well. And I think it's just about getting into a habit of it. You know, you've got to try one and stick with it for a little bit.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Thank you very much for answering that.
You're welcome. So we've got another question about how to produce a gluten-free loaf. So I think we'll see Lucy run us through the process of it. And as she said before, it's definitely an art. And we will try to figure it out and kind of do it and send it over to everybody. You're all signed up to the campaign. You're all going to get this recording anyway, so we will do our best to write something down, and then you guys can try it at home as well. So we've got another question from Dulce. I usually take about 2 to 3 days to produce a loaf of sourdough. Is this then too much?
Oh, can it be too much? It depends if you're pleased with your loaf, if that's how it works for you and that's the process that you've managed. I think this is the wonderful thing about sourdough. You do kind of develop what works for you. And so the only thing that can happen if you're leaving it to ferment for too long, it does really start to lose the structure in the dough and it can become really difficult to handle, and you won't really get much structure in your loaf. So it's almost impossible, I find, then to do like a free form. So I would, but it probably tastes amazing because it's had such a long time to ferment. It'll be really sour. So I don't think it can ever be too much from a health point of view, but maybe just from as far as how your loaf looks. But I'd be interested to know if you're happy with your loaf that you've taken that long to produce. I should say I use, I'm going to just let you see this book. I don't know if you can see there. It's called Do Sourdough by Andrew Whitley, and he's a kind of British sourdough king, really. And this little book, it's one of these little tiny ones. It's just a couple of nights read. I read it once on a journey to Scotland and it's so good. It just takes you through the simple process of sourdough, and so that you understand what it is you're trying to do when you're making it. And he does sort of talk about the fact that you will, once you understand what it is you're doing, you can sort of make it to fit in with your lifestyle. So it's called Slow Bread for Busy Lives for that reason. That's a really good book, and the recipe that I'm going to share with you is very much taken from this. We
have the pleasure of Andrew, I mean, unless it's a different Andrew, but Andrew is actually with us this evening.
Really?
Yeah.
How exciting.
I don't know, Andrew, if you want to unmute yourself and say hello, or if not, that's fine too. What a wonderful recommendation you just got.
Thanks, really kind of you. I'm just writing in the chat that I have to go to another meeting at the moment, so I'm really sorry to have to leave you, but thank you so much for the presentation, Lucy.
Oh, it's really good to meet you, Andrew. There you go. I had absolutely no idea you were there. I'm so sorry, but then there you go. I've just given your book
everyone else
what
has
a lovely coincidence.
Yeah, and everyone else has got to believe that.
I'm sure there's a lot that you could add to everything I've said. So that's super that you've joined us. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you so much. But I'm sorry, I do have to go now. Okay, excellent. Well, there we go. That was fantastic. Life's full of surprises. So shall I just get started and show you what I do, and we can keep chatting while I'm going, and just fire away any questions, Emma, that come up. So I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible.
first of all then, we're literally starting with flour, and it's a really good time to use organic flour when you're making sourdough, because you don't want to have chemicals in this, because we're trying to use the natural yeasts and bacteria that are present in the flour. So I would always go organic. I mentioned that I always use hodmedod. So this is my whole wheat YQ flour. So all the goodness is in it. And then to make a sourdough, which is when you're starting out at least, which is sort of easier to get a better rise, I do half or just a bit less than half white flour. Again, it's organic, because actually when you're kneading all whole grain flour, the bran just really cuts through your dough. And so for me, I find I get a much better loaf if I do use some white flour. So flour, water, and honestly, I just have a milk bottle that I've got the different measurements for the different weights of water that you need for different stages of the process. And I just have my milk bottle ready at hand, and sea salt. So sea salt, water and flour. And then as far as equipment goes, it is really important to have clean hands. But any good baker will say that the natural yeasts on your skin are also very good for sourdough. So it's important to get your hands in there. I then have a scraper, which I find really useful. I have just a very traditional loaf tin. And then we have the starter. So this, I don't know if you can sort of see it, but it's tricky to see the bubbles because it is bubbling away. It's always difficult to see that on a screen. But the key things so before I actually tell you how you make your starter, it's good to keep it in a jar where you haven't got too much room for air in the top, because the really important bacteria are what we call anaerobic. So we don't want them to be in touch with air too much, but you need to have a little bit of space in the top of your jar, because when your starter is quite active, it bubbles up. So you need to leave room for that. So that's about the right size jar for that amount of starter. Sometimes I have quite a lot on the go and I have a much bigger jar. And this is actually the kind of jar I'd recommend. It's got just a nice wooden lid with a seal. And that just, I find that basically the more natural the equipment you use, again, the better for your sourdough. So number one then, I should also say, Andrew would say to use filtered water. I don't always have filtered water in the house, and so sometimes I do just use tap water. Again, it's just whatever's practical for you. So with a starter, basically it takes about 5 days to get a starter going. Now you might know somebody who has a starter and they could just give you some, great, and you can just get started. Otherwise, making your starter is stage one of the process. And all you're doing, and I'm not going to go through this in great detail because the recipe is going to come to you tomorrow anyway with all of this in it. But basically over those 5 days, what you're doing is you're adding flour and water, and you just keep topping it up with flour and water, and gradually you start to see the fermentation process beginning. You start to get some bubbles and you keep it in a warm place. I always use rye flour to get my starter going, because as I mentioned, rye has much more natural yeast in it. And this is quite an interesting point, that you always want to use the same flour for your starter. So I've had this for years. It literally is like a little pet. It stays in the fridge most of the time. I get it out just before I want to use it, but it can sit in the fridge and be completely abandoned, and it doesn't matter. And then I can explain to you how you may need to activate it. But basically it's a very low maintenance living thing in your kitchen. But it is important to always use the same flour, because that can really interrupt the fermentation process in your starter if you start adding in a new type of flour. So I always use rye flour, but I use that rye starter to make any kind of loaf I want to. Let me just pause a moment because my battery is a bit low and I see it's just come slightly out of its socket there we go, that's better. It had just fallen out of the socket. So more detailed description in the recipe tomorrow on how you on the quantities that you need, but very, very quick and easy, literally 5 minutes every day, just topping up with flour and water. Day 5, your starter is bubbling away and ready to go. So the next thing you need to do is stage 2, which I call the sort of intermediate dough. So like Blue Peter, I have one I prepared earlier. So I do this stage in the morning. So if I want to have a loaf of sourdough the next morning, fresh out of the oven, I start it 24 hours before, and I just find for me that sorry, let me just I've got something buzzing in my background here. I just find for me it works really well to start the process before breakfast, or just when things are going on in the kitchen. So this is when I start my production sourdough. And again, if I show you, maybe if I go that way, you can sort of see the bubbles in there. It's like a sort of honeycomb in a way, and those are all just the natural, that's just the natural yeast. You can see it quite nicely there. That's literally in here is just some of your starter, some whole wheat flour, some white flour and water, and I do just use water at room temperature, and I mix that all together. And I did that this morning, and that's probably about 3 times as big as it was when I did it this morning. So by the evening, you've got this very active intermediate dough, and that's your middle stage. So then about this time of the day, actually, so just before bedtime, I prepare the final loaf. So I've got my starter here, I've got my middle stage that I did at breakfast, and to finish off the loaf, what we then do is mix more of the whole wheat flour, and it's about 200 grams, I think. Yeah, so 200 grams of the whole wheat flour. Guaranteed this is when it's all going to get nice and messy. And the same of the white flour. And as I said, it's all organic. And in you go. There we go. And then I work in weights of water, so it's 300 grams of water. And this is actually, it's been sitting out, it's nice room temperature. So I add that in. And then it's about a teaspoon of salt, which is about 5 grams. So in that goes. And then that needs a good stir. And Andrew Whitley would say, use your fingers at this point, but because I'm demonstrating, I just want to be able to function. So I'm not going to get too messy. So I'm just going to get a little wooden spatula to stir that. So just give all that a really good stir. And another thing I've actually discovered over the years that I've been experimenting with this is that you can actually, I have a KitchenAid food mixer that I use for baking. You can do this stage with a dough hook in the mixer, and it works really, really well. But I know traditional sourdough bakers would shudder at the thought of using machinery. So I shouldn't really mention that, but it is just saves you getting in too much of a mess. Now, ideally, you want to leave this stage, this final stage, just sort of sitting for half an hour before continuing on to make the loaf. So now I would go and sit down and read a book or something for half an hour. But for the purposes of tonight, I'm just going to get going with it. So now what we do is we mix that middle stage dough, which is the lovely active fermenting one, with this mix of flour that I've just made. And this is where the scraper comes in really handy, because it just gets it out of the bowl. And the thing is with sourdough, it does end up being quite a wet dough, But actually that's good, because to get a light loaf, believe it or not, the wetter your dough, the lighter the loaf, seems to be the general rule. So then what we're going to do is we're going to combine those two doughs together. And in a minute, I'm going to actually just tip it out onto a floured surface, but I just like to get it going in the bowl. So the other thing is with making sourdough, because it's got all these lovely natural yeasts and it's a very slow fermentation, this next stage that I'm about to do, which is the kneading, is just for 2 or 3 minutes, whereas when you're making loaf with the sort of industrial fast action yeast, you do have to knead it for quite a long time to get the gluten, to begin to break down the gluten. But the nice slow fermentation with sourdough does all that for you, really. So as Emma says, it pretty much makes itself while you sleep. So now I've got that onto the floured surface, and I just sort of use my scraper to help, I guess, just to sort of turn it over, incorporate. I'm just incorporating a little bit more flour, just to make it a bit easier to work with. Sometimes you need to, and other times you don't. So then we're just going to need the very last bit, really. And this is really just to help mix it all together. You can add things at this stage if you want to. You could add in some seeds. I know Katie, our chef on the Gut Project that we work with, she adds in seeds and I guess even nuts. You could add in, you can get quite inventive and try using different flours. So many different wonderful flours. They all have their own different flavors, and the more types of fiber, as I mentioned, that we can include in our diet, the better. 30 different types of fiber a week is what's recommended to really help our gut health. So you can see that's kind of a nice sort of dough. It's coming together really nicely. You can sort of get quite technical, and you can do things like, you can see if it's when you stretch out the dough, whether you get the sort of nice window effect in it. And actually this dough looks like it's worked quite nicely, but to be honest, as I said earlier, I am quite practical and I need to be realistic, and the only way I can kind of manage to incorporate making sourdough into my life is if I'm not too perfect about how the loaf actually looks at the end of the day, because I know it's full of goodness. And I guess as a nutritionist, what we end up, we perhaps look at our food a little bit differently, and we sort of think, I know what's in here, I know this is really good for me, so I'm just going to enjoy eating it, as opposed to, I need it to look perfect and I want it to look like the most beautiful loaf. So so there we go. So that is ready to go into the tin. And what I find works quite well in helping the dough not stick to the tin is some semolina, actually. So I've got some here, and I'll show it to you. It's just the yellowy, it's quite coarse, and so it really helps to stop the dough sticking to the tin. Or you can be brave and try a freeform loaf. But I don't know, I just have much more success with cooking it in a tin. So that's my preferred method. And then what I do is I scoop up my dough, pop it in the flour, and then you kind of just fold in the edges. If you can see what I'm doing there, you just kind of keep turning it around in the flour, folding in all the edges, and you'll find you end up with quite a nice sort of tight ball of dough. And eventually you can just kind of end up with the actual seam where you've rolled it goes at the bottom, and you just plop it in your tin. it's slightly stuck to my fingers, which it shouldn't have done. But anyway, so the sort of cylinder shaped dough with the seam at the bottom is now sitting in my tin. Top tip, what I do then is I scoop up the flour that's made a bit of a mess, and if you just sprinkle it right down the sides of the tin, so literally the flour is going down the side of the unrisen loaf. As the loaf rises, it takes that flour up with it and it helps it to stop sticking. And that's it done. And then that just sits out overnight I just use a bag over the top as a proving bag, and that's it. So a little bit of a mess to clear up, but I probably maybe do that twice a week. And there is nothing better than waking up, even before I've got out of bed. I wake up and I'm so excited because I remember I've got a lovely risen loaf to go down. I put the oven on, and when everyone's having breakfast, there's a lovely loaf of sourdough cooking, and it's so cheap and easy, and it is the most nutritious food. So I hope that has helped shed some light on the wonders of sourdough and the nutrition that we should be getting from our bread. I am going to wipe my hands before I touch my computer. And while I'm doing that, maybe you want to have a chat and send some questions Emma's way. So I shall be back in a mo, Emma.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That is just fantastic. As a gluten-free alternative, rice flour works quite well instead of the semolina. So there are definitely ways to make a gluten-free sourdough. We just haven't gotten it perfected to be able to write it down and confidently send it out to everyone. But if everyone's up for trying, then we will pass on some of the things that we do ourselves. So does anyone have any questions for Lucy? Lucy, I think you've done your job really well. Has anyone got anything they'd like to share? I think what I'll do is I'll stop the recording now.